Hello, everyone. I'm Derek Horton, and welcome to the third in a series of talks related to the exhibition A Tall Order, Rochdale Art Gallery in the 1980s, which is on at Touchstones Rochdale now and until the 6th of May. A Tall Order looks at the exhibition programming in Rochdale during the period from 1980 to 1993, when Jill Morgan worked with a small group of women, one of whom is our guest tonight, to create a space for often marginalised or excluded artists to present work that express their own concerns and experiences. They also presented the gallery's historic collection in new and critical ways and created opportunities for education and engagement with the local community in Rochdale and demonstrated the potential, I think, for galleries to function as a social tool or a tool of social change. And they contributed to a small network of galleries, mostly in the north of England, that were doing similar work, which is going to be very much part of the conversation that we'll hear more of tonight. The two previous talks in this series by Leslie Sanderson and Sarah Edge, talking about art making and exhibition making in a feminist context, and by Malcolm Glover and Pogus Caesar, talking about approaches to documentary photography. Those two have already taken place, and you can find recordings of them online by searching for Touchstones Rochdale on YouTube. And there'll be three further talks in March and April as the show continues. Keith Piper and Pete Clark will talk about depicting history for today. Harold Offey and Michelle Williams-Gamaker will talk about self-portraiture and representation. And Sarah Joy Ford and Veronica Slater will talk about genealogies of queer art and modernism. One of those is online, like this one, and the other two will be live in-person talks at Touchstones Rochdale. And you can find out more about all of them and book places on the Touchstones website. So the exhibition A Tall Order has been co-curated by Alice Correa and me, and now I'm going to hand over to Alice to introduce tonight's very special guests. Alice is an art historian who works on late 20th century British art with a particular focus on artists of African, Caribbean and South Asian heritage. She's a research fellow at the Decolonising Arts Institute at the University of Arts London, and she's recently edited the anthology What is Black Art, published by Penguin Classics. So over to you, Alice, to introduce our two guests for this evening.
Thanks very much, Derek. I wasn't expecting you to introduce me as well. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's very special event. Tonight, we're going to be talking about networks of Northern curating, and we're going to be thinking about the position of Rochdale Art Gallery in relation to other regional galleries in the north of England, including Bluecoat in Liverpool, but also other gallery spaces such as the Harris in Preston, the Grace Gallery in Sheffield, and the Ferrens in Hull. And we want to think through the importance of these regional networks in establishing collaborative and generative conversations that supported regionally based artists and artists who were otherwise excluded or marginalized in the mainstream. We might also want to touch on, in today's conversation, notions of the regional or the provincial in terms of narratives of British art and how the histories of British art in the 80s have predominantly, I think, been London-centric, which is something that the exhibition A Tall Order has really sought to challenge. And so I'm delighted to welcome to tonight's event Bryan Biggs and Bev Bytheway. Bryan Biggs, I'm sure needs no introduction, but he is currently Director of Cultural Legacies at the Bluecoat Gallery in Liverpool, where he's been based for many years. Bryan has written and spoken extensively about the history of the Bluecoat and about the Liverpool art world. In 2009, he co-edited with Julie Sheldon the book Art in the City Revisited, which explored and examined the visual arts of Liverpool. He's also been responsible for some landmark exhibitions, including Blackskin Blue Coat, which we may talk about this evening, and worked with Autograph on John O'Comfrey's landmark film, The Unfinished Conversation, which was exhibited in 2012 as part of the Liverpool Biennial at the Bluecoat. Bev Bytheway was Assistant Exhibitions Officer at Rochdale Art Gallery in the early 1980s and worked closely with the Exhibitions Officer, Jill Morgan, on a number of important exhibitions. She then joined Cornerhouse in Manchester as an Exhibitions Officer, and she was subsequently the Administrator for New Contemporaries between 1995 and 2009. She currently works for the John Moores Painting Prize. So welcome, Bev and Bryan. Thank you so much for being here. To kick things off this evening, I wondered if you could briefly describe how and when you respectively came to work at the Bluecoat and at Rochdale, and what your role was. In tonight's conversation, I think we want to sort of unpick perhaps what it meant to be an exhibitions officer, what it meant to be a curator in the early 80s, and how that may have changed over time. But if you could start by saying what you were doing, how you came to your positions. Bryan, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, for me, I started work at Bluecoat a very long time ago, in the late 70s, straight from art school. I was a BA graduate in fine art and had no experience of curating. We didn't regard ourselves as curators at all, exhibition organisers or whatever. And my first job was as an admin assistant at Bluecoat, and I graduated to becoming what was called gallery director. And, you know, in terms of what we did everything. In terms of, selecting artists, putting on the shows, literally putting the shows up, installing them ourselves, and doing press releases and everything. So we were very much sort of one man. Well, at Bluecoat, very much sort of one person band, I suppose. And most of the people who I worked with were in a similar position. They'd come as art graduates.
Was that your experience, Bev?
Well, no, slightly different. I studied the history of art. So I was an art historian, or a graduate of art history. And I studied at the University of East Anglia. And I specialised in 20th century. And I was very fortunate my lecturer at the time was Jane Beckett, Dr. Jane Beckett, who was the complete inspiration. And completely just changed the way I thought about things right from the start. So I went in to be a sort of early Renaissance specialist, and I came out wanting to work with contemporary artists in contemporary gallery spaces. It was a huge shift. And I had no idea how to go about that, because I wasn't from that sort of background at all. So I just did lots of voluntary jobs in galleries in different places, and different sorts of galleries. So I worked in an art centre in Norwich called Premises. And then eventually I ran out of money and ran out of enthusiasm, really. So I went back home and started volunteering at the Icon Gallery in Birmingham. And that is where I met Antonia Payne. And Antonia Payne had just left Rochdale Art Gallery, and Antonia Payne had worked with Jill Morgan, and Jill Morgan was Antonia's assistant. So she knew that there was this job coming up for an assistant exhibitions organiser at Rochdale Art Gallery. I knew nothing about Rochdale Art Gallery. I don't think I'd ever been to Rochdale. Anyway, so I applied for the job. And I think that was my stroke of luck, was meeting Antonia Payne. And she acted as a reference for me. And then I was successful and I got the job. Jill interviewed me. And then I started in Rochdale, first job, absolutely stunning. I started in 1981. I think I was only there, I think I went in towards the end of 81. I was at UEA 77 to 80. And I left, I think, around 1984. So I was there for about 3 or 4 years. And I was Jill's assistant. And like Bryan said, there were only 2 of us. So you were involved in every aspect of, you know, the gallery's programme and the gallery's work.
Brilliant. That's fantastic.
But it was my first job.
Amazing.
So a steep, huge learning curve, but, you know, so exciting.
Yeah. So the tall order, a tall order takes its title from the proposition made by Jill Morgan that she wanted Rochdale Art Gallery to challenge conventions and exclusionary practices in the arts. And our exhibition aims to show a range of the diverse artists and types of work that were exhibited at Rochdale Art Gallery in the 80s. And I know that, Bryan, at Bluecoat, you've been thinking about the gallery's history and the gallery's exhibition programs, and you've recently done small displays about the program in the 1980s. So I was wondering if you could both give us a sense of what was the artistic landscape like in the 1980s in Liverpool and Rochdale. I'm quite conscious that within sort of what we might sort of broadsheet responses to art, the 1978 Hayward annual exhibition that was all women received considerable backlash. Abstract painters like John Hoyland were being celebrated on the BBC on TV programmes, and Henry Moore had his 80th birthday in 1982, and there was Henry Moore exhibitions here, there and everywhere. So if you could give us a sense of what was happening and what it was about your respective institutions, that what was different about them.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I mean, the established artists did dominate the media, but I think things were shifting even within what you call the established art world. I mean, there was the new British sculpture, which was very object based, was sort of connecting to a much wider international avant-garde, and that was all very exciting in the work of Bill Woodrow and Tony Cragg and all that stuff. So I think even the art world itself was shifting. But for us, I suppose, I've been thinking about this. There was a few things happening at that time. Artists were starting to take over former industrial sites. So this sort of growth of artist-led spaces, like in Liverpool, you had the Bridewell Studios, for instance, which I think was late 70s when that started. So it's a different sort of model of production, I suppose. Artists were producing in different ways, and if you go around to artist studios and see what was going on, you had new art magazines emerging, like Art Monthly, which is quite important, but Artist Newsletter particularly so, in terms of that network of opportunities, finding out what artists could actually apply for, and things like Aspects magazine in Newcastle, which were mainly they were sort of about art, about artists rather than about the art market or anything like that. And so there was this sort of network emerging, particularly the Northeast was very strong for that. And we were looking to those sorts of places and going to, if I'd do gallery visits to London, I wouldn't really go to the Whitechapel. I'd go to, the Pentonville Gallery or the Black Art Gallery, or, these galleries that were just starting to emerge in unfashionable parts of London. So there was this sort of alternative network happening. And importantly, the artists I was talking to are artists of my age or my generation, who were looking for places to show, and there were more opportunities, like open calls for exhibitions. Obviously, New Contemporaries, which I think we hosted in 1986. That's when we first showed Leslie Sanderson's work. We showed Keith's work then as well, Keith Piper. But we were doing our own open calls as well, particularly for local artists or Northwest. I think later on in that decade, or even into the 90s, we were doing collaborations with Cornerhouse. So I think there was this alternative emerging, and it seemed to be that it was happening not in London so much. It was happening in London, of course it was, but our network was a regional northwestern one, really. So I'd say that's what I can come on more about what sort of shows we were doing and what sort of practices, but that was just an overview that I think the landscape was shifting in terms of production and dissemination of writing about art.
Yeah, I think that's I agree entirely. I mean, I think for me, just starting out at that time, you did get this sense of change. You did get this sense of there being something new and emerging. Everything was emerging. Everything was sort of emerging at the time. And I think, you'd sort of, when I left UEA, for instance, you were just beginning to become aware of Griselda Pollock at Leeds University. You were just beginning to think that there was a different way of thinking and looking at images. And I think in the early 80s, everything was being sort of challenged and tested and questioned. And I think the whole thing just exploded throughout that decade. So you were I think you were aware, you had this new wave of British sculpture, which was beginning to ask make different kinds of work and ask different things. But you were sort of aware that everything was just being challenged. And I think, the other thing which was really important is it was an incredibly politically, socially challenging time. There was agenda after agenda after agenda, and there was lots of social unrest, and there was, so it was a very politicized time, which got more and more and more throughout the decade, because obviously it was the 10 years of Thatcher's government. Most of the, like Rochdale and Bluecoat and Liverpool, and I would say that most of that network that we started to explore and develop across the decade, you were looking at, largely regionally based centres and urban centres, and they were your Labour-controlled governments. They were the centres of opposition. So I think, the whole of the landscape was quite politicised, and there wasn't this connection with London and the South, because, as far as I could see, nobody had voted Conservative up in the North, and we had no, so they were extraordinary times. So I think, for us to be programming, you were working with those artists of your generation, of those times. Those artists were speaking about those times, and your gallery was a place where you could bring those debates and discussions and conversations. So I think they're extraordinarily interesting times now, because it was so different in the 80s.
Yeah. And I think so just to say, I think just to back that up, I think new practices were emerging too.
Yeah.
Which didn't really have a place at the big venues, but certainly if you look at things like live art was starting to happen in very much a sort of regional way. There's lots happening across the country, and things like the National Review of Live Art, which we took part in. That was a network that started in Nottingham and then went to Glasgow, but all around the country had live art happening, which was difficult to sort of commodify as a gallery practice. So that was interesting. A lot of site-specific work was happening. We were doing things that went beyond the gallery, quite small interventions, or in some cases quite large work in looking at Liverpool's sort of colonial history and its Victorian sculptures and what it meant, engaging with all that. And I think you had the beginnings of video art for us, because we had Moviola moved into our building, which became Fact. And that was Eddie Berg started to do some really interesting, the festival called Video Positive started in 1989. And Liverpool became a sort of home of that new video art. The only the only sort of national festival was happening in Liverpool at that time. So I think these new practices, it was easier for likes of Rochdale and Liverpool to present that work than it would be for the established galleries.
And I think it was that generation. It was that sort of first generation of pioneering women artists that were making use of new media, because it was that whole sense of a sort of finding a new voice or means in which to kind of put your voice forward. So it was that women's association with new media and installation and sort of temporal practice and live work. And I think that was really pioneered by that generation of women artists. And it was all to do then with identity and identity politics, but it was carving out a different space and a different way of working.
Yeah.
You know, which I think was really, again, really important.
Yeah, I'm interested in that actually, in terms of your position as curators or exhibition organisers, and how conscious you were as people positioned within the institution that you were doing something, you were approaching exhibition making in a way that might have been different to what had happened maybe 10 years previously in the same institution or in sort of other more sort of nationally focused venues. Did you get a sense of that you were sort of outsiders within your sort of amongst your peers institutionally?
No,
No,
I don't think so. I think you were responding to the work. I think most of it was that was where the most, you know, that's where where the most exciting work was being produced. You were responding to the work and you were responding to the artists. And I think I felt like you had a responsibility in terms of your space and trying to provide a space and a place for especially women artists at the time, and for new forms of expression. And I think you had in those days there weren't you had a responsibility to actually sort of help in the development of practice. So you were not only giving over space, but you were trying to commission and produce work with those artists in order to be able to provide support to those artists, you know. So I think the whole thing was that you were all exploring it together, and you were all involved in these incredibly exciting, you know, intense discussions, and it all really mattered. And they were you know, they were, yes. So I don't know. Anyway, I think.
Well, just from my perspective, when I joined the Bluecoat, it was fairly sort of conservative program. But I knew that when I did a bit of research, I could look back at the origins of the art centre, and you go back to 1911, and Picasso and Matisse were shown there in the Post-Impressionists.
Yeah.
Yoko Ono performed there in 1967. Captain Beefheart, you know, who was a musician, had his first painting show in 1972. So I knew there was this other tradition, if you like. And although what I inherited was quite conventional, and it took me maybe 4 or 5 years to really introduce my own the program that I was really wanted to do, which, like Bev says, it was about engaging with the now, and it was very much, you know, what I saw as vital work. This was urgent work that needed to be shown, particularly when I went to see the first show of Keith Piper's. You thought, yeah, I've got to show this work because it was the most vital work that was happening. And it wasn't just within visual art. I mean, I was looking at what was visual art. I wasn't just looking at fine art, but there was all sorts of interesting things happening in graphic arts. You know, we did exhibitions of sort of comics and posters and record sleeves and all sorts of stuff. So I just did it. I mean, I didn't really worry about whether I was doing the right thing. What I did sort of know was that it didn't reflect. It wasn't written about in the art mags particularly, although, you know, we did start to get reviews and that. But initially, you were doing this stuff completely under the radar. And as Bev says, you did it because you believed in it, but also they were your mates. A lot of the artists were, they wanted to know your opinion. You helped them curate the shows with them rather than being external curators. It was very much co-curated in the proper sense of the word in those times. It was just amazing. When I look back at like 1982, the show that from the ICA, Urban Kisses, which Ivana Blaswick put together, we brought that to Liverpool. You know, the most current work from New York with Cindy Sherman, Robert Longo, and Keith Haring, and so on. and we just about squeezed it into our space. We probably shouldn't have taken the show because it was really cramped, but you could take those sort of risks and do these sort of slightly crazy things.
And I think there's also a thing about, maybe it's to do with the position of regional galleries as well. I mean, what you have, which is different in a place like Rochdale, was its embeddedness within its town and within its community and within its civic pride. And that was, you know, and that's all the sort of network of those local authority funded municipal galleries, which were largely collection based, you know, but they occupied a really important position within their place. And I think that is something that, you know, that is something that we had a very, very strong base at Rochdale in terms of the support that the gallery had within its own community, and in a way that gave us a sort of base on which to begin to explore and develop the programme even further. You know, the gallery had always played a prominent position within its community. It had always supported artists, you know, and there was no, apart from the Bluecoat, there was no centre of contemporary art or modern art in the Northwest. You know, there wasn't so you felt again that you sort of wanted to make your gallery a living space that connected with what was going on in the world and connected with your, you know, practicing artists.
Yeah.
You've mentioned that there was local support, and previously you've mentioned the importance that you were in Labour controlled councils, and I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about that and the relationship between the gallery, the council, and funding and regional funding, and how you were able to sort of do things that were maybe on the edge or act under the radar, and do things that were a bit different, whilst also sort of maintaining those relationships with funding bodies and the council. And I know, Bryan, the Bluecoat isn't a municipal gallery in the same way, but the sorts of relationships that the Bluecoat had with its local constituency, I think would be really interesting to hear a bit more about.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We weren't funded. We weren't run by the local authority, but we did eventually get funding from them, and that increased over that period, despite, you know, quite difficult circumstances. That the council did maintain its support, which was really appreciated. I mean, I just want to mention those, just the local authority galleries, because I think that was a really important network, and as Bev says, they were all Labour authority run. And I think in a way, you know, the GLC was very important as a sort of an inspiration. What Ken Livingstone was doing in London was to, you know, with those progressive cultural policies were starting to be adapted by the metropolitan authorities before they were abolished, of course, by Thatcher. So we had Merseyside Council, which was got rid of. But I think some of those policies did have a real impact. And it is noticeable that some of these emerging things that are happening, like the Black Arts movement, all the big shows were in Labour-controlled municipal galleries, and that's really significant. We weren't one of those. So to come back to your question about our local constituency, I mean, the local artists were really, really important. And again, that's one of the things that I inherited when I started there, that there was always local shows. And basically, if there was anybody any good, they'd get a show with us. I mean, it was as simple as that, because we did a lot of shows. When I started, they were like 3-week long shows, which went to about 4 weeks, then 6 weeks, then 8 weeks. But initially, you could do a lot of shows in a year. And if you did large, like Christmas exhibitions with like 100 artists, you could show a lot of people. And I think that was really important, to give artists who were emerging from the art school or from whatever in Liverpool, or moved to Liverpool, they would generally be supported in some way by us. And I think that was really important. And it didn't matter if they had a reputation or not, or they were going to be the next stars. If there was interesting work, we would try and show it in some way. So I think that was our local community, was the community of artists, I'd say, was the most important one. Obviously, in a bit later on, and certainly going to the 90s, we did a lot more work with actual communities, artists doing socially engaged practice in communities. But I think for me, it was having that that large pool of artists that we could draw on who would support you, and because you supported them, that was really important.
Yeah, because it's something I was thinking about earlier. Most of those kind of network of galleries in the Northwest and the regional galleries, you know, you're sort of your mapping in Sheffield or Midland Group in Nottingham or wherever, also were connected with their own regional art schools. So, you know, in Rochdale, we were lucky because we were right next door to the Rochdale Art College. So it meant that you had students and lecturers and visiting artists that were that you know, which would have been your absolute core audience. But like I say, because of that sort of embeddedness within the town, you had much broader audiences than that. And I think that whole what we were trying to do is kind of like, well, how do you make contemporary art matter to people within the town of Rochdale? I mean, that was your agenda, really, was how do we make this matter, and how can we make a difference?
Mm.
Really
In
fascinating.
terms of funding, I mean, you know, there was the funding came through from the Rochdale Metropolitan Borough Council, and you were given an annual budget. We had 3 galleries at Rochdale at the time, and then you had to seek additional funding. You know, so your main resource was the Arts Council of England and Northwest Arts Board, as I think it was then known. So you had your regional arts councils and you had your national arts council, and then also you looked for other partners and other collaborators, you know, as a means of making the money work.
Yeah, it does. It did seem when Derek and I were looking through the archives that there are reams and reams of funding applications.
Absolutely.
And you must have spent a long time, a large proportion of your working day, filling in arts.
Well, in those days, you
arts board applications.
You know, in those days, you applied per exhibition or per project. You know, so you know, there wasn't the sort of national portfolio organisations, or you know, so you were constantly on the treadmill of funding applications. And changing priorities within the Arts Council.
But could you say a little bit more about, in that context, why touring exhibitions became so important? Because I can think of a number of shows like Along the Lines of Resistance that was at Rochdale in 1989 that started at the Cooper Gallery in Barnsley, and a number of others that seemed really significant, and indeed the show that Keith Piper and Pete Clark will be talking about in our next talk, Depicting History for Today, I think was a touring show that started in the regions and bypassed London. A lot of these shows didn't go to London, which I think seems significant. I was wondering if you could say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to talk about the show that Eddie Chambers did, one of his first franchises. He got this funding through Innova. Before this is like pre the Innova that we know. There was a scheme called I forgot what it was called, but it was actually the funding that became Innova funding. But he was one of the franchised curators. There was 3 of them, and one of his first shows was called Black Art Plotting the Course, and that was a collaboration with the Bluecoat, Oldham, and Wolverhampton art galleries. And we that's how we did it. So we worked as a sort of team with Eddie. But it's significant that none of those galleries were in London, and that show didn't go to London. I don't think it did anyway. And most of Eddie's didn't. I mean, that was the strange thing. They had these, you know, they were really important shows, those big group shows. I know they became a bit, you know, maybe outdated a bit later on, but at that time they were really significant, and it was an important way of bringing, like we were doing with our group shows, you know, bringing a lot of work to the public attention in one go, you know, accompanied by a really good publication. So that was an example of that. But these were the natural partners for us, either in Yorkshire, West Midlands, or the Northwest. They were our sort of partners. And I looked at the other day at who we were mainly collaborating with, and it was pretty much the Midlands and North, and occasionally the Orchard in Derry, or the CCA, or the Third Eye as it was then in Glasgow. And the ones we did in London were tended to be with much smaller venues, or the ICA, as those sort of shows they did down the corridor, those, which is where a lot of the most interesting shows were held, actually.
But I think, I don't think that's a negative at all. I think it was the regional galleries that were producing the most important. It was the regional galleries that were changing the debates and changing the discussion. London wasn't. London was much more, I would say, the provincial than, the fact was that the debates were going on. I mean, it's like, it was against the backdrop of all those things. It was the miners' strike. It was, it was the Falklands War. It was the race riots. These were what were defining where we lived, and were defining society and our place. So actually, I don't think London was engaged in those sorts of. I don't think we were looking necessarily for validation by the capital or by London. I think we were actually much more progressive and much more challenging. So to me, it was the regional network that is really important. That's what changed things. It was, and it's now you look at it and you kind of think, well, it doesn't exist anymore. It was the regional galleries that were the commissioners, the producers, the distributors, the agenda setters, in response to
it's interesting what you're saying there, Bev, because I read something only a couple of years ago about I won't say who wrote it, but it was talking about Lubena Himid's work, and it's saying that she had to show in local authority galleries. That's all she could do. These were really important galleries. It wasn't like they were second best. That network was hugely important, and those shows like Into the Open at the Mapping and so on, they're really significant.
Yes, absolutely. They were the defining, that sort of. It was, yes, absolutely. I think London was a very different place then. I mean, I think the critical, the critical. Or the press and all of that was very much London centric. So maybe your sort of regional artists and your regional galleries didn't get the same sort of level of coverage, or critical reception.
I think it's important to say also that although we supported our local artists a lot, regional artists, it was a lot of artists from London who got their first breaks in the regions. They got their first big show outside of London. So because obviously mainly the Black Art movement, if we're talking about that was mainly focused in London, not exclusively, but many of those artists would come to Yorkshire or the Northwest or West Midlands to get their first proper show.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, just sort of thinking through this relationship with the local and the social politics and the Labour councils and how all of these dots join up. I just wonder, Bev, if you could go back a bit to think about, or to say a little bit more about how local council support, how local council policy rather supported or was in tandem with what the gallery was trying to do in terms of its engagement with the social political environment in which Rochdale Art Gallery existed.
It's a big question, and it's a really interesting question. I would say that actually, I'm not sure that it was really, because I don't know if culture was so much on the agenda in those days, but I think it became to be. I mean, I think it developed over the decade. But, I think the sort of the local authority. I mean, there was a very enlightened, brilliant man at Rochdale when we were there, who David Johns, who was Jill's line manager within the local authority, and he was extraordinarily supportive of the gallery, and you know, enabled us or protected us, and gave us the encouragement to do what we did. But I don't know. I don't think it's that sort of. I don't think they had a cultural policy which we then went on to, you know, kind of put into practice. I think they very much learned from the gallery, and I actually think sort of it was the other way around. I think it was, you know, but the gallery raised the debates at a sort of political and cultural level, and that then began to influence the sort of policymakers. But I'm not so sure that they were that aware of what was going on.
Yeah,
I
doing
think
it by stealth.
Yeah, in Liverpool you had two interesting things. One was there was even a Black Arts unit within the council, which was very supportive, mainly of sort of performing arts. But we did a lot of collaborations with them. But then along comes Militant. Now Militant did not support the arts, and they saw us as elitists. So you had this Trotskyite entryist council running Liverpool, and they wanted to cut the arts. So no, I think there was not that alignment when Militant was there.
I think it's quite complicated and
complex. It's a complicated history. It's really complicated.
Yeah. So we've got about 20 minutes left. So I was wondering whether or not you could each identify. We've mentioned a few of the exhibitions that took place at Rochdale Art Gallery and Bluecoat, but I wondered if there was a particular exhibition or set of exhibitions that really stood out for you from that period in the 1980s that really encapsulated the ethos and approach that your institutions took or were taking towards exhibition making. Was there something that really sort of sticks in your memory as being absolutely fantastic and that you achieved what you wanted to, that you set out to do?
Well, there's so many. You have mentioned Black Skin Bluecoat, so I'm going to talk about that just briefly. But that was a show in 1985 which had Eddie Chambers, Sonia Boyce, Keith Piper, and Tom, who became Tam Joseph. And that was the title which Eddie Chambers, I think, came up with. And it was our first foray, if you like, into this emerging generation of Black British artists, and it was really, really important for it. I don't think we realised at the time how important it was, and it really took a couple of years to sort of gestate. And then from that point onwards, we became a venue that was seen as a space that would be open to emerging artists of colour from, you know, all sorts of different backgrounds across the country. So that for us was an important exhibition, not just because of that, but also because we developed really good relationships with three of those artists as artists and curators. So we worked with Sonia Boyce as artist and curator. Obviously we worked with Eddie Chambers a lot as a curator, and we worked with Keith as an artist but also as a curator of Trophies of Empire, which was in 1992. And in a way the 90s for us were as radical, if not more radical, than the 80s actually. So I'd say that was an important marker for that exhibition, and it's been looked at from by PhD students, and it's becoming, I think, recognised as an important exhibition. But I just want to mention a couple. Can I mention more than one?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Of course.
We did a show with a guy called Ray Walker, who you probably won't know, but Ray had died by then. And Ray was a Liverpool-born muralist, and based in the East End of London. He worked on the Cable Street mural, which is still there. And it was like a memorial show after he died. It was in 1987. But again, it was really interesting exhibition to how do you present public art in a sort of gallery context. Yeah, other than having a lot of photographs of murals, but it was a really important show for us to have a debate around, quite a traditional way of making public art. And I think at the same time we had Jill Posner, who was a feminist artist who would go around defacing billboards and stuff. So we public art, even when you're bringing it into the gallery and having a debate around it, was really important. We did a lot of talks around that with people like Lorraine Leeson and Peter Dunn, the Greenwich Mural Project, John Carson, who was at Art Angel then. So just one exhibition like that, which was quite traditional in a sense, because his work was very figurative, you could have a debate around it in terms of the place of public art, which I thought was really important. So that's just a couple. I can mention more, but that will do for now.
Thank you, Bryan. That's brilliant. Bev?
I don't know if I can single out. I mean, I think because, well, partly because I was only there for a couple of years, but it was also to do with the it was what you it was how you programmed over time and which artists you chose to work with, and to me that is sort of the more important story. I mean, there are singular exhibitions like Pandora's Box or you know, whatever, but it was to do with, you know, so there was all of that sort of generation of women artists. So you know, sort of Susan Hiller, Rose Garrod, the Rose Garrod show, which I think came in from the Icon Gallery, which I think Antonia Payne had done. You know, there were the sort of residency projects. So there was things like, there was Malcolm Glover, who was the photographer that sort of came in as a kind of residency to document the Asian community in Rochdale. We had the first ever performance art residency with Marty St James and Anne Wilson, and that was collaboration with Rochdale Art College. You know, and that sort of thing around developments to do with live art practice. And there was this wonderful project that Jill did where she connected the traditions of the witch walks, which, you know, took place in lots of smaller rural communities around in and you know, made the connections between wit walks and a kind of live practice. So it was how you developed those sorts of things and how you developed over time. And I think it's programming a place over a time. And some of the questions that you raised. So then there were, you know, really important artists like Steve Willits and Terry Atkinson, and all of whom, you know, made projects for Rochdale and wanted to work with the gallery. So it's more a cumulative thing for me. If I had to single out one thing that I was particularly was to do with our ethos, but it was the Laurie Anderson project, and the fact that Rochdale Art Gallery was the only venue out of the ICA, outside of ICA London, to take the Laurie Anderson show when she was #2 in, you know, the charts with O Superman. I mean, that was an extraordinarily special moment. Yeah, where you have this sort of bloody New York superstar shown at Rochdale Art Gallery. Extraordinary.
Yeah. It's curious that I've looked through the records, and although we talk about this, you know, we're very similar galleries, we didn't actually collaborate. Rochdale and Bluecoat didn't do any touring shows together. But you see the same artists. Like we mentioned, that Rose Garrod show came to Liverpool as well. Yes. But also, you know, Pete Clark and John Hyatt. First saw John's work at Rochdale. Yes. So there's a lot of crossover the artists that we work with.
Yeah, and Bev, I just wanted to pick up on your comment about developing a program and developing, and I suppose goes back to what Bryan was saying about developing relationships with artists over a significant period of time. And I wondered how your work at Rochdale went on to inform what you did at Cornerhouse, because I know that some of the artists that had been shown at Rochdale showed at Cornerhouse, and how you navigated that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, Rochdale was incredibly important, and a lot of those relationships that started at Rochdale continued, you know, and I worked with quite a lot of the artists that we'd worked with at Rochdale. I then carried on working with at Cornerhouse. So people like Steve Willits and John Hyatt, Terry Atkinson and Rose Garrod, all of, you know, and that was great, because then you maintain friendships and relationships with their work and their practice over time too. So Rochdale was extraordinarily important, and it was really formative. It was where everything, all your ideas were being formed, you know, and you were beginning to think about what was it that you wanted to do as a curator or as a programmer, and what were you interested in, and what was important, and it was where everything was formed for me. It was incredibly important. But also, I think for the gallery as well, you can see when you look at the decade of the 80s at Rochdale Art Gallery, you know, across the period of its programs and Jill's time there, again, you know, it was very it progressed over time, and it, you know, ideas were formed. It moved from, you know, the sort of early days of kind of women's work and a new media and new practices, and then the sort of enabling of voices from different groups and different communities. So then you start to get the sort of, you know, the emergence of the sort of, you had the emergence of women's work, and then you get this sort of emergence of Black voices and Black art, and all of these things are sort of, you know, are developed over time and become consolidated and become, you know, yeah. So the whole program is it's not just, oh, this week we're going to do that, or next week we're going to do it. It's developed over a period of time, and as your confidence, you know, with your confidence and your support and your networks, and
yeah, brilliant. And we've got a bit of time left, so I just wanted to sort of perhaps finish with thinking about that evolution over time, because Bev, you've discussed programming and the fact that your job title was Exhibitions Officer, and Bryan, you sort of seem to have hesitated using the word curator a few times. And I know that we've spoken previously about this notion of the curator that exists today, and I just wondered if you could maybe reflect on what it meant to work in an exhibition as an exhibition maker in your institutions, as opposed to perhaps now with this thing called a curator, where we have degrees in curating, and perhaps to reflect on the differences between now and then.
Yeah, I mean, I want to use an example of when Tate arrived in Liverpool. So curating with a big C arrived when Tate of the North, which became Tate Liverpool, arrived in 1988. Because I think this will illustrate the point that the week they opened, we had two things on. One was an exhibition by Sakari Douglas Camp, British or Nigerian artist working in London, doing beautiful animated sculptures. And we also did a performance by Visual Stress, which was a Liverpool-based collective called Death by Free Enterprise. And apart from what it was trying to do in the title of the piece, it also said it was cleansing the Bluecoat of the taint of slavery. I quote. So in a way, it was decolonizing our building. So we were having these debates. We weren't having debates, but we were doing these things. We were allowing artists to come into our spaces and decolonize them, mess things up a bit. At the same time, the Tate was almost like consolidating an establishment sort of, you know, a London-centric view of the art world. If you look at its opening exhibitions, were very sort of conventional in that sense. And the curator, as I say, was that's where you'd find the curator. Was the Bluecoat, you'd still find an exhibition organizer who just let artists do what they wanted. So I think that's where we are now. That the things that we could do then, like that Visual Stress performance, which literally did, you know, take the Bluecoat building apart in a very noisy and ritualistic way, we couldn't do now because of health and safety issues, risk assessments, and the fear of offending people. And I think that's probably where we are now, that we're very risk averse, and there's things there's a lot of timidity now, I think, because everyone's too nervous to upset everybody else. I'd say that's the main difference from what we did then. And I'm not to say that you can't now do outrageous things, but I think for galleries, certainly the ones that are getting publicly funded, it's a very difficult landscape.
I mean, It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I never was a curator. I wasn't a curator at Cornerhouse. I wasn't a curator at Rochdale Art Gallery. I was a programmer. And to me, there is a difference. And I kind of think it was to do with the relationship of you to your venue and your place as well, in the sense that actually, it was about sort of you as a facilitator for artists and artist practice, and for supporting artist practice and providing opportunity for those artists. So it was a different kind of relationship. It wasn't about, yes, you led some of the direction, and less you provided a sort of direction within your program and the ideas and the issues that were raised by your program. But it was always in a much more collaborative sort of way. You know, you were visiting these artists, you were looking at their studios, you were discussing their work, they were involved in the making of their exhibitions at your space. You sort of, it was a much more, to me, a much more sort of, it wasn't as distanced as I think a curator is, or as academic, or as directive as a curator might be. I mean, suddenly in the 90s, you know, it was the notion of the curator emerged, and it was exhibitions curated by. And actually the curator became as significant as the work, or even more so in some cases. And that really wasn't the way in which we were making exhibitions in the 80s at all. I think it's a completely different agenda.
Great. Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes left, and so I wanted to invite Derek. Did you have any final burning questions for Bev and Bryan?
I think you've covered so much ground, and I've been kind of hinting at questions to you during the conversation as well. So I don't think I've got anything specific that I think we haven't covered. But I mean, I do want to say thank you to all three of you, but to Bryan and Bev particularly for some really interesting insights for me, and I'm sure for you too, Alice, into a lot of the history that we've been looking at and trying to encapsulate through the exhibition, but also insights about what's changed and what hasn't changed, and what's changed for the better and what's changed perhaps not so much for the better. And you know, it's been really interesting to hear both of your ideas on those things. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Unless Bryan and Bev, you have any further burning things that you want to say.
Well, I would just like to say, if I may, but you know, I would just like to say thank you to you two for actually initiating this project in the first place, because I think it's a really important exhibition. And I think also what I would like to say is it's the Rochdale Art Gallery is just one part of a much bigger story, you know, and that whole history of exhibition making in the 1980s in your regional galleries is such it's a story yet to be told, yet to be researched, you know, and I just think it's really important. I think that whole area is you know, needs some study.
Well,
yeah, I think it's happening. I mean, that's what I was going to say. One, what a fantastic show! If anyone hasn't seen it yet, get along to Rochdale, because it is absolutely brilliant. But also, I mean, as Eddie Chambers points out in his interview, he said Rochdale was not alone, and
Yes, exactly.
and even if we weren't networked, there were venues and you know, places, not just doing galleries, but you know, off-site projects like Projects UK up in the northeast and so on. So I do think that study is starting to happen. We've certainly had a couple of PhDs working on our archive. Angelique Dalal Clayton's done some brilliant work around Sonia Boyce's work with us and Black Skin Bluecoat.
Yes.
And you're starting to see that now. We're getting a lot of requests for people to see our stuff. So you can actually look at quite a lot of album material online, which is great. In the Bluecoat archive is now online, and we're going to do more and more of that. And importantly, what we're trying to do now is to connect that history, the history of a, if you like, progressive contemporary gallery in the 20th century, with the history of our building, which goes back to colonial times and Liverpool in the 18th century. And that's a really fascinating thing, to look at these continuums across history and how these colonial legacies connect with what contemporary artists are doing today. And I think the 80s was really important. That's when that process started for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're both right in, Bev, in the sense that there's a very undiscovered and unwritten about history there in relation to the north and the regions, and I think you're right as well, Bryan, that it is starting to happen, and I think it's very much our hope that our current show at Rochdale, and indeed these conversations as well, and the fact that these conversations will exist online and be available for researchers and people looking at this area. I hope that we're making a contribution to developing that discussion and writing some of that unwritten history.
Yeah, and certainly the conversation will continue, definitely. I will round up there, but thank you so much, Bryan and Bev, for your fascinating insights. It's been a real privilege listening to you talking about curating at Bluecoat and at Rochdale Art Gallery in the 1980s. I'd like to thank our audience watching online, and those who are watching the recording of this. Please note that there'll be other talks available online and at the gallery, and all the information is available through the Touchstones website. And we look forward to seeing you at the next talk. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Bye.